thank you so much for inviting me to speak at your event, and congratulations to all of the award winners. That's really great news. So you should be celebrating yourselves. And I hope that the talk that I give today is of some use to you in your future work that tries to pursue open science. So thanks again for inviting me, especially to Julia, who did the invitation. So today, my talk is going to be all about data. So not about publications. So you're getting a really good sort of two of the major areas of open science today with Marcel's talk and with mine. I will probably also flatter librarians. I work with a lot of them, and I think they're doing great work in this area. And I will start by saying that you can probably tell from my bio that I am on the cheerleading side of open. I do believe that open is a good in its own when it comes to scholarly communication, but open in terms of freely accessible, but also in terms of transparency. But as Marcel has said very clearly, it's not a panacea because it doesn't address equity fully, it doesn't address diversity in a whole range of different ways. But to me, I think the problem is not about open, it's about the mechanisms that we have in place for trying to achieve openness, and they are immature at this point. They, in the sense that they are in the early stages, and there's a lot more that we can do around it. So I'll leave that there for that. And I'll move into my slides, if I can do it right. Yes, okay. So in my talk today, I'm going to really be bringing together three different sectors or three different worlds. And those are the worlds of humanities research or humanities researchers, the worlds of, and thank you for defining it, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, the GLAM sector, or sometimes called cultural heritage institutions. They're sometimes called memory institutions. And then the third is the world of repositories, and there are overlaps between all of these. I'm in that bottom right bubble in the world of repositories, but interact as a course of everyday work with all of these different areas. There are drivers that connect these worlds, and that's, I guess, the kind of the interest of my talk today in terms of looking at the concept of fair data and how this relates to humanities researchers and how those worlds can sort of complement one another. So for humanities researchers, you require access to sources, primary sources, secondary sources, all different kinds of sources, and you create new resources as part of your work. I'm referring to both of these as data for the simplicity, and that's because of the world I'm in. I'm in a world that refers to the kinds of outputs that surround publications as data. But I do come from an academic background where I never would have used that word in the past to describe the work that I did, so I can understand linguistic differences here. Bottom left, in the GLAM sector, these are organizations that hold and care for objects that are of value, that are deemed to be of value, and of course they're all sort of like historical reasons, good and not so good, for why particular objects are deemed to hold value, but that is what they do. And they are mandated to share these objects as widely as possible. And they're assessed on the basis of the interest that is shown in their collections. So, you know, a lot of galleries, libraries, archives, and museums that we work with are assessed based on the metric of footfall, people coming through the door. As you can understand, that's been relatively difficult for the last year and a half with COVID. But increasingly, they're also assessed on the basis of access to the digital objects that they hold online. Clearly surrogates in most cases of the original, digitized things, but that is something that their value is assessed, I guess, by their funders and by the publics that engage with them. Okay, and then there's the world of repositories. Repositories provide archiving, curation, stewardship, preservation of data, but in terms of digital objects. So we're just looking at the digital side here with the rest of my talk. And oops, I can't use the arrow key. There we go. These worlds come together, or they overlap in certain kinds of ways. And the ways that I'm going to talk about today are in terms of what they share. So they share content types or data, as I'm using today. They share users, or these could be visitors, researchers, audience members, depending on which term you like. But they also, all of these worlds are in this moment currently sharing requests and mandates and requirements around open access. The open scholarly cycle and open in terms of data held by GLAMs as well is a very all-encompassing and very present movement that's occurring. So these are on the agendas of a lot of organizations. And I would argue that they can all benefit from preparing and sharing their data in ways that align with the principles of fair data management. And I don't know how familiar everyone is with FAIR and how it fits into the research lifecycle, but so I'll give a bit of a talk on that. Okay, so this is a picture. If you've seen these sorts of things before, then you've seen many different varieties of them. This is one that a group that I work with, a working group for ALEA, All European Academies, put together, looking specifically at how it relates to FAIR data. So there are different stages in the life cycle, and it's a circle intentionally because one stage feeds into the next, and sometimes the output of one stage becomes the input into another. So for example, if you look at the bottom right where it says collect, produce, structure, and store data, then you do that with your research data. It gets deposited into repositories and disseminated, where then it becomes the input into other kinds of research for humanities scholars, and that's the identify at the top right. So when I'm talking about data in this talk, I'm talking both about the inputs into research, into the research process, the sources or resources that are used, and also the outputs, what comes out of that research process. And often there's similar kinds of things, but they may be manipulated, interrogated, collected, arranged in different ways as part of the research process in order to create the necessary collection or corpora or whatever your particular discipline uses that you then study and write the paper to publish, preferably open access. But one thing I do want to say as well is that how data are shared impacts their reuse and impacts the sort of extended value of that data. So what I guess I'm suggesting here is that a strong contender for a pathway that you can follow in terms of sharing your data is to follow the FAIR principles. And I'll get into what those are. But before I do, why do we want to share data in the first place? This is a question that often arises. And I would say that it probably arises in humanities circles a little bit more than in some other areas. And there's a few reasons for that, which I will get into a little bit later. But some of the reasons that you want to share your data. Well, significant work goes into identifying, collecting, curating, annotating, and preparing the sets of data during the research process. So there's a lot of effort that goes into this, and it's a useful effort to collect that information in ways that make it better for the work that you're going to do. And these data provide for a fuller understanding of the published work that emerges from study and investigation. If you can actually see what went into that publication, the sources that were used, you can potentially get a fuller picture of it. In the life sciences, this is often considered quite important for research integrity processes to make sure that you can replicate the work or the outcome that is found in the paper by going back to the data source and seeing if it actually matches up. I don't think that aspect is as key for humanities scholarship because humanities scholars are engaging in a kind of intellectual argument that isn't the same kind of proof as we're looking for in the life sciences, but they still do provide this fuller understanding. And in the worlds of open science / open scholarship / open research, and sometimes they use these interchangeably, in these frameworks, data themselves are valued as an output in their own right. Now, I think we have a long way to go before institutions are recognize this work or before funders recognize it as well, research funders, in ways that make it a real benefit or a real incentive for researchers to share the data. So I'm not pretending we're there yet, but in principle, at least, it is recognized as a valuable output in its own right. So we have work to do on how that actually plays out. And then I think the key point is that shared data can then be reused to build on discoveries. They can also be credited to the research. So this can enter into the kind of cycle of researcher evaluation and promotion, but only if they're shared in meaningful ways. So what are the FAIR principles? I am not going to spend a lot of time on the details of this because it can get fairly technical and it's an ongoing debate. And really FAIR is a kind of continuum. It's not that you either have made your data FAIR or you haven't. It's about the processes that are involved to try to get to this state. It comes from an article that was published in 2016, so this isn't very old really, and it's just starting to be expanded and explored. But the essential thing is the FAIR principles argue that research data and other outputs should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It's an acronym, but it also has semantic meaning without the acronym status. And there are 15 principles. But the key elements here, and this is where librarians and archivists really come into play because they know all about this, is that it's important where your data is deposited so that it can be found and kind of properly curated to fit your disciplinary requirements. The richness of the metadata that describes and contextualizes the data is very important. The use of formal and shared disciplinary terminology or vocabularies is also key. And then also it's very important to be able to indicate the provenance of that data. There's a lot of trust issues around that, and it's important for historical research. And also the access conditions. Okay, the data is out there, but what can other people use it for? What are they allowed to use it for? How can they get it? And these kinds of things. So that's a very brief overview of the FAIR principles themselves. Okay. So what is the rationale for this acronym of FAIR? Well, it's part of the broader open research movement. There's a very wide support for it across research sectors globally. Now, of course, different jurisdictions have different resources to be able to try to implement FAIR and to support scholars in this process, but it's being acknowledged, I would say, globally as an important step forward or a potential way to try to bring a kind of openness and transparency to the data collected in the process of research. It fundamentally it is about openness. It's about transparency, in some cases about the reproducibility of research, as I mentioned earlier, and also about research integrity. But it's also about efficiencies in the research process and accelerated discovery. In other words, if there is a data set that's already been curated and prepared, and perhaps even annotated in certain ways, you can build on that if you can get access to it, as opposed to collecting the same thing from scratch yourself. So it's meant to try to accelerate and enhance academic discovery. From the funder perspective, it's about better return on investment from public funding. And the simple argument here is, if we have paid researchers to do this work, then the outputs of it should be openly available to any citizen, because the citizens are the ones that pay the government, that give the money to the funders to pay the researchers, right? So it's a public return on investment. And then from a researcher perspective, the idea is that it leads to greater exposure of your work, greater usage, and potentially greater impact. And again, a lot of work needs to be done in that last one to fulfill this cycle. And there are initiatives happening to try to make that, to try to advance that, but it is about a shift in research culture and incentives and rewards in general. Okay, next. So there are particular challenges in every discipline, and humanities, of course, is an umbrella of disciplines, but some of the ones that come up regularly are these. So I thought I would throw them right out there from the beginning. One argument is that open science is for STEM. It's for the so-called hard sciences. It doesn't really matter for humanities. One of the arguments is that we can't even share our data because of copyright issues, and we're using other people's outputs, so it's not the same kind of thing. And furthermore, we don't even produce data. What is this data you speak of that you want us to share? So these are the kinds of arguments that we hear, and some of them are, they're valid in lots of ways. So I'm trying to be a bit playful here with them, but I do have responses to these to take a look at, and I'll take a few quotes that have been useful, I think, in addressing this relationship between FAIR and the humanities. So this one here says, when you call something data, you imply that it exists in discrete fungible units, that it is computationally tractable, that its meaningful qualities can be enumerated in a finite list, and that someone else performing the same operations on the same data will come up with the same results. This is not how humanists think of the material they work with. I think this is a very insightful statement and very accurate in terms of sometimes the way that the concept of data is understood and why it seems to fit so awkwardly with the humanities. I just think part of the problem is just the word data, because it's so loaded historically in terms of the way we look at it, and we think of spreadsheets and Excel sheets and that sort of thing. Here's another example. In the humanities, we resist the blanket term data for the very good reason that we have more and precise terminology. For example, primary sources, secondary sources, theoretical documents, bibliographies, critical editions, annotations, notes, and so on. We have these terms available to us to describe and make transparent our research processes. And there's a preference for using those terms because, again, data is seen as reductive. And then to the question, or to the sort of statement that humanities don't produce data, here's just a partial list of the kinds of data that are used in both ways, as I mentioned before, as inputs to the research process and as outputs from the research process. And I'll save myself the time, and I'll save you all me reading this entire list, but I think we'll probably be sharing the slides afterwards. And in the bottom right is just a little cover of something that I worked on with the ALEA E-Humanities Working Group. We released this last year. So if you want to look into more targeted advice around sharing fair data in the humanities or from humanities research projects, this is a kind of set of guidelines that looks at it across different areas. Oh, I didn't put the DOI there, but I can tweet it later. Okay, so it's also true that humanities scholars do have particular challenges that aren't faced as much by other disciplinary groups, and one of those in particular is around copyright. You can say, well, how can I share data if it's already copyrighted? It's not an all or nothing situation when it comes to FAIR. And so the idea is to make what you can as fair as possible. And a really key point here is that fair data and open data are not the same thing. The terms should not be conflated as being equal to one another. So data could be fair, it could be open, it could be both of those, it could be neither of those. So the greatest potential reuse, one would argue, is when it's both fair and open. But I guess the argument behind it is that it's worth trying to make your data fair, to make it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, even if you have to restrict it and not make it open, because there are sensitivities around that. In the social sciences, there's often sensitivities around interview data. It could be quite, it could be dangerous for those that were interviewed if that were shared right away. And so you can put embargoes in place and that sort of thing. There are solutions around this. I'm not going to speak to this slide. I just really like this picture, and this is by the young European research universities. They did a sort of diagram of open science. So I thought I'd throw it up there while I said just a few more things about this. There's lots of discussion and initiatives around implementing open science in a way that is equitable and equally valuable across disciplines. And this kind of conversation has to continue. One of the indicators that open science is trying to tackle is the impact factor that is associated with journals. And I think why this is such a hot debate is I think there's a sense, someone has a sense that scholars are driven primarily by impact factor and that we need to change that. But I think that scholars, particularly humanities scholars, if I may, are driven by impact itself, not by a journal impact factor. The journal impact factor is the thing that is used to assess their research in a very simplistic kind of way, right? So it's that needs to change. It's that assessment process that needs to change. I think in the humanities that scholars are driven by the creation of knowledge in a way that tells us something about our world, about ourselves, and about history. And those are the real drivers. And so when it comes to open science and how this relates to humanities research, I think, to use a metaphor, I think that the open science train has most definitely left the station. It's not going back. And so it's up to us. And when I say us, I mean people from the worlds that I'm including in this talk. Humanities researchers, those working in libraries and archives and other elements of GLAM, repositories, etc. It's up to us to kind of help determine the journey of that train, of that open science train, and see where it may need to branch off in a particular direction or not. Okay? And there's various advice emerging from, for example, the European Commission that underlines the fact disciplines need to find ways to implement fair data principles in ways that support their needs, that it has to come from the community. So again, it's not meant to be a one-size-fits-all solution, and maybe in the discussion afterwards we can talk more about that. Okay, so if you just stay with me on my argument and agree tentatively as I continue this talk that we're going to work towards FAIR, then the question becomes, what do we do about creating open, accessible data sources? Okay, and the best that I can do to address this question is to talk about what we do at the Digital Repository of Ireland, because they're concrete examples. They're examples that come from the worlds we inhabit, but they're examples that demonstrate how we've tried to address this entire topic, and how we work with the GLAM sector and with community groups and with repositories that support resources from GLAMs. Okay, so before I talk about the examples of what we do, I'll just give you a little sense of what we are, and Julia said a bit in the introduction. So essentially, the Digital Repository of Ireland is a national trustworthy digital repository. That means it's been certified to make sure that we're doing things correctly and it's not going to fall apart and we're not going to lose your data. It means more than that, but those are some of the essentials. And we store, we preserve data from the sectors of research and culture. So we have depositors from those two main sectors in Ireland. The kinds of data that we have that are within our remit are social and cultural data. That's what I would call them kind of casually. But if we're talking about what kind of disciplines they support, it's the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And I think that, again, the data that is social and cultural data, often stewarded by libraries and archives, and the kinds of data that comes out of the research process in the arts, humanities, and social science, these two, again, are very similar kinds of data. So in a sense, the DRI is serving both of these worlds and trying to facilitate the interaction between them. So we do things to support FAIR. We do things within the repository itself. We support something called persistent identifiers. So that means that once you assign a URL to data, it can't disappear and it has to be traced. So you don't get broken links like you do on a website. We support standard metadata formats and vocabularies and these kinds of things. So that's what we do sort of technically and in terms of archiving policy. But we also do a ton of work to support, I guess, open science and FAIR development in general in the community, because the technical side of supporting FAIR is not the tough part. The tough part is all of the interconnections and work and understanding and progress and research that goes in at the community level, right? So this is more of a social challenge than it is. I think FAIR is more of a social challenge than it is a technical challenge. So NORF is the National Open Research Forum in Ireland. We're heavily involved with that. There's the Research Data Alliance, the European Open Science Cloud, ALEA's, the European Academies, and the Europeana, many of you will probably have heard of. It's kind of online library from content, cultural heritage content from all across Europe. So we work with these networks as well. How am I for time? Oh, not bad. So the last part of my talk, or the sort of second half of my talk, I should say, is I'm going to give you 5 different ways that we build repository holdings, okay? And I think at the same time, also build the community, because these two things have to happen in tandem. These are the examples I was referring to. Okay, so here is the first one. So first things first is that DRI is a membership organization. So other institutions have to join us to deposit. It's completely free for anybody to access the data. And we don't charge any kind of long-term storage fees, but we have a small fee for the members to join in the first place, so that we can, we can cover costs. But we are not for profit and publicly funded, so this is really just about covering those kinds of costs. So what I want to show you here is some of the collections that we have. And then the bottom left is one of the very first collections that we had in the repository when we first went live back in 2016. And this is an image from one of the main streets in Dublin that is now called O'Connell Street, but at the time was Sackville Street. And it's of a destroyed building during the Eastern Rising in 1916. Why I show this one is that these photographs by Westrop were actually located, there were copies, physical copies of them in 2 different libraries in Ireland, but their exposure was very limited. You kind of had to know that they were there and get permission to go see them. But now by putting them in the repository, they have a much wider reach and they can be studied and viewed. And they're of great public interest as well. And then in the top right is, I think, the most recent collection we've had deposited at DRI, which is from our National Postal Service. And it's a series of, I think, 2,300 stamps from 1922 to 2019. So the huge history of what was commemorated in Ireland on the face of stamps. It's an excellent collection for research to kind of trace Irish culture and social developments through visual culture, for example. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is one of our ways into trying to facilitate FAIR and to facilitate the open sharing of data is to build strong connections with existing archives that have great collections, and to then help make those open and make them FAIR. My second example, or the second, I guess, way in, is we try to help to open up archives that aren't hidden by design. So they're not purposefully meant to be hidden away. It's just that it's really hard to know that they're there, right? So we reach out to archives that serve smaller or less visible or underfunded communities. So this opens things up that are not as accessible and that are potentially hidden, but it also intentionally aims to diversify the holdings that we have in the repository to paint a fuller picture of Irish society and culture. Because if you only go with the existing well-funded institutions, then you're getting data that has been built up over time based on government priorities and funding priorities over time, right? I'm not saying that there aren't a ton of archival activists out there working in big institutions, but the narrative that comes out of state institutions tends to reflect state priorities. So we try to go to some of the smaller ones as well. And this slide gives just a few pictures to show what I'm talking about here. So in order to make this happen, we decided we had to kind of bend our membership model a little bit because the charge, even though it's not very large, can be a barrier to some organizations, even administratively, to try to get permission to pay those funds. So we started in 2018 a Community Archives Award. And the purpose of this was to try to advertise that we were open for working with smaller archives to provide additional support for metadata creation and that kind of thing, and that we wanted to sort of help them to do digital preservation. So the first time we awarded it, on the top right there, it was to the Cork LGBT Archive, which is an incredible archive that was put together as part of a PhD project that documents the history of queer culture in Cork, which is one of the largest cities in Ireland, giving that visibility. And then the second year that we ran it, that little picture on the top left, which is these sort of little portable houses, was to a group called, actually an individual called the Asylum Archive. And what the guy who put this together was doing was trying to document the process of people that were trying to seek asylum or refugee status in Ireland, and in particular, something called direct provision, which is the particular way that the Irish government aimed to approach the asylum process. It's an approach that was highly criticized and very controversial, and is being reviewed because it was not favored by most of the citizenry or by refugees. And so what he did is he wanted to document that process. So we were able to take that into the archive as well, and to provide something more critical about Irish history amongst the collection. And then there's pictures of other winners in later years, but I won't go into those right now. Okay, a third approach that we've taken to, again, try to facilitate, support, and create more openly available data according to the FAIR principles. So number 3 is that we've aimed to identify at-risk material that will disappear or potentially close off, be less accessible if it isn't preserved. Now, often this this could be a personal material collection in someone's own archive. They're harder to find out about unless they come to us. But in this case, we're talking about born digital content. So content that is created on and for the internet and really lives only on a website somewhere. Or as you can see in the bottom right, this is definitely not an advertisement for Facebook or the metaverse or whatever they're going to call themselves. But there was a collection that that was created on Facebook, and it's an incredibly valuable one. So a couple of years ago in Ireland, there was a national referendum, a huge campaign around this. And the question was essentially, should we legalize abortion in Ireland? Because for those of you who don't know, it was illegal here until just a few years ago. And there was a huge campaign. A lot of it was run on Facebook. Oh, thanks, Julia. She's giving me the time warning. There's only 2 more after this, so I'll be okay. Huge amount of material, a lot of it on Facebook. That sort of thing doesn't stick around. So we were fortunate to apply to the Wellcome Trust for funding on this, and we got some funding to be able to go out to the organizations that are holding this content online and prepare it for archiving in DRI so that it will be around for future research. Okay, and the 4th way is that we try to help bridge the gap between meaningful content that exists and the archiving and preservation of those resources. So it's easier if I give an example on this one. So this is a group that does not have a collection in the repository. We would love it if they want to in the future, but they're not in a position to do that right now. But essentially, it's a group called Black and Irish. They started an Instagram account last year, basically to try and tell the stories of the lives of Black people in Ireland, because this is a group that is entirely visible in terms of historical representation in Ireland, but is not, but is a group that has a presence, and so they aimed to try to tell those stories and to show that presence. But they did it all on Instagram, which, you know, completely terrified me, because I thought, what happens if the Instagram account goes down? They've done all of this work collecting a photograph and then a story of the people to create this collection. And to me, what they were doing is creating an archive. And so when we spoke to them, it hadn't occurred to them. They weren't thinking of this as an archive. They were thinking of it as a present moment campaign. But they're doing great work. And so now they've been teaching us a lot about working with community groups. And we've been talking to them about licensing and consent and ways that they can potentially be able to preserve the material for longer. And then the final one, and this brings me to the end, is that it's not all about just getting things into DRI. With the Black and Irish example, we may never have their collection, but we hope that by working with them, their collections will have even more visibility, but more importantly, will have more sustainability, right? And that's the end goal. So other things that we do is we work to build awareness around the value of open collections, right? So it's not just about the collections themselves, but people need to know about them. So there are different ways you can do that. You can connect, you can disseminate, you can exhibit. And the top right is an example of connect. We started something called the Early Career Researcher Award. And this is an award for an ECR who uses DRI content within their research. So we're trying to get researchers to engage with it, because again, we're still quite new, right? So you have to get your data out there. Just making it open doesn't mean people will find it. That's one way. We work with Europeana, that's on the bottom right, to help disseminate. So we aggregate content to Europeana so it gets a wider viewing. And then the bottom left is we actually take on some research projects ourselves to build archival collections. And one of the ones that we did that closed off last year was to tell the story of the NGOs and organizations and individuals that worked for social change in Ireland and were funded by the Atlantic Philanthropies, because the Atlantic Philanthropies has closed down. So we have part of their archive, and we collected new oral histories, so that's data, to help illuminate the work that was done and to record it in a more fulsome kind of way for future historical research. So this is, where are we at the end there? So those are the 5 ways. And to conclude, I really think that humanities scholars can help to lead the way here when it comes to fair data and how it's developed to suit the humanities and to work. Because your scholarship, as I've said before, requires data inputs and it creates data outputs. And using FAIR on both ends assists in discovery, reuse, archival enrichment, and citation. And these are all useful things as part of scholarly communication. It's been argued many times that FAIR implementation has to be adapted to fit disciplinary needs and practices. So this is why I encourage involvement. And the questions you can ask are, what do researchers need from libraries, archives, and repositories to do their work? How can libraries, archives, and repositories benefit from the work that humanities researchers are doing? And think in terms of partnership. I helped to work on this little book that's on the right here, or booklet, guidelines, called How to Facilitate the Cooperation Between Humanities Researchers and Cultural Heritage Institutions. I think it might win the award for longest title. And that was with Daria. So there's sort of concrete examples of how you can do this in there if you wanted to take a look. Okay, that brings me to the end. But thank you very much. And I guess I will stop sharing and then I'm happy for any questions.